Realistically, most for-profit ventures of different kinds are kind of trivial undertakings. And this is what I mean, that like at the end of the day, there'll be another company. At the end of the day, companies will die, they'll go away, new companies will come up. When you're a startup, I mean, I'm in a startup right now, and every day feels like an existential day. That's what it feels like when you're in a small startup, because you're fighting for survival. Like you're fighting just to get to the next thing. But most companies of any size, legitimately, if everyone left one day, or if everyone just decided to not even work for a month or two or three, nothing that much different would happen in the company.
Welcome to the Product Tea with Leah. I am your host, Leah, and we are about to spill the tea with the best from tech about product growth and senior leadership topics. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Product Tea. Today, I'm reading an intro that has been crafted by AI that I have never seen before, and I ran a deep search model over it and then a reasoning model from the Chinese about a good friend of mine. Ladies and gentlemen, strap in for the experience, a whirlwind tour of product management's most delightful, unhinged mind. This man isn't just a product evangelist. He's a habit-hacking wizard who would rather dissect your calendar than let you drown in another yet useless framework. Imagine Tony Robbins crossbred with a stand-up comedian, then tossed into a tech startup blender. That is him. He's the guy who coined Bring Back Fun as a corporate manifesto. He fights zombie habits like a workplace Van Helsing, and once compared starting a company to jumping off a cliff while assembling a plane midair. With a newsletter called The Beautiful Mess, because perfect is for amateurs, he's the chaotic good genius teaching teams to laugh at their own dumpster fires. He's been called a professional canary for sniffing out corporate bullshit, and rumor has it, he once fixed the product roadmap by making everyone sing karaoke. If product management had a rock star, he would be shredding a guitar solo on stage while explaining scaffolding for cross-functional teams. And yes, that is a real thing. So grab your popcorn, because this is not just another podcast episode. It is a masterclass in turning chaos into magic, one snarky tweet at a time. Let's ride the Cutler Chaos Coaster. Welcome to the Product Tea, John Cutler. How are you doing this morning?
Wow, I'm completely honored that AI could manufacture that word salad for me, but that's exciting.
Yeah, this is the current state of tech. So here's what I did just for those. This is actually true, right? Like I did not alter any of this. I asked AI to make a funny intro about John Cutler, make it snappy and over the top funny.
Yeah.
Make it so that I can read it within 30 seconds. I think it was a bit over the top there, but I used the deep research feature from Perplexity, and then I ran the reasoning model over it as well, like the R1, just like, hey, look this over. And yeah, that was that. So yeah, John, what's up? What do people get wrong about you once they get to know you?
I'm going to have to process that. You've given me some good ideas of how to get back at you later on today. Yeah, things are going well since we last spoke. Started a new role, having fun with that, kind of back doing product management every single day, all day, but still chatting with a lot of teams because they're sort of our customers. And so that's fun as well. But it was definitely a gear change, evangelism or product operating roles or things like that. But yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
Well, it's funny because I appreciate you being here because it only took like 3 months of me harassing you, like literally harassing you. I even made a LinkedIn post, which was one of the most performant posts I did all month then, to just like get in contact with you. Then you did contact me. And then I asked like, hey, what's up? And then you ghosted me again. So, here we are. So I'm very glad to have you. So I have to kind of invent an inventive or like an imaginary podcast. So you're even spending time with me. But yeah.
So maybe this podcast doesn't even exist. This is just actually like an elaborate ruse.
This is exactly what it is. Also, my audience is paid people just to make sure that I have other celebrities come on that do not exist either.
Crisis actors. I'm just kidding. Sorry.
No, totally fine. So, John, we have brainstormed for hours and days, if not weeks, on what we should talk about. And we have come up with an academic idea for this particular podcast, which is very much in the sense of the current times. John, why do we suck so much at working?
Interesting. Well, I don't think we all suck at working. It's probably a distribution there. But I think working is hard because it involves humans. And humans are humans. And humans have different incentives. And I'll tell you this. I've thought about one part of the question is, Realistically, most for-profit ventures of different kinds are kind of trivial undertakings. And this is what I mean, that like at the end of the day, there'll be another company. At the end of the day, companies will die, they'll go away, new companies will come up. When you're a startup, I mean, I'm in a startup right now, and every day feels like an existential day. That's what it feels like when you're in a small startup, because you're fighting for survival. Like you're fighting just to get to the next thing. But most companies of any size, legitimately, if everyone left one day, or if everyone just decided to not even work for a month or two or three, nothing that much different would happen in the company. And so I'm going to respond to your question with sort of a thought, which is what makes work difficult in the environment we're working in for the most part is that people think it's like a rational endeavor of profit maximization or a rational endeavor of maximization. And there's a great theory called the garbage can theory of organizational development, which I subscribe to, which is that companies are organized anarchy. They're rather trivial concerns where people are negotiating their needs in the format of a company. And that's why we suck so much at it, because people imagine that the goal is actually to do well and to make money and to be super successful as a company. But in most companies of any non-trivial size, the goal is actually more like a negotiation of needs within the company. And to give you a very practical example of that, I wrote a blog post once called, the number one way any company could get better. And it was rather controversial because I got some pretty harsh comments on it. But I basically proposed that in your company, N percentage of the people in your company are smart, talented people. In fact, there's a group who are highly skilled, and they're skilled pragmatists. They try to make something better. The company pushes back, other people push back. They read the tea leaves. They don't want to necessarily risk their job, or they don't want to risk having to spend too much trouble or heartache on the job. And they basically check out and do a reasonable job and don't rock the boat. And that's how the company, you've got 30% of your people or 50% of your people fit in that category, right? They're not antagonists. They're not going to go there and shout from the rooftop and keep telling the founders, we could change this. We could be so much better. And they're also not going to do a terrible job because they're smart. They're going to do what they do. But they've basically checked out. They're not going to go above a certain limit. And so I think that when you consider, that's an example of what I'm talking about, where most companies are running in a mediated, degraded mode, where people are getting their needs met for the time being, and the company outcomes are just a sort of somewhat byproduct of that happening. So that's a very, maybe it's a realistic / pessimistic, but also kind of sociology-based view of what's happening in companies and why things aren't as great as we think they are in many cases.
So what you're saying is that it sucks to work in corporate environments universally because the majority of the people who are in them are just not A players. Is that what you're saying? Because now I'm using very specifically vocabulary that is going around on LinkedIn. I'm not sure whether you've also heard about it, but...
Yeah, remember, LinkedIn is just performative, right? That's people trying to carve out their personal identity via their communication, right? So from that perspective, imagine that it's all virtue signaling in some way or another. And I do it too. You could have virtue signaling about, tending to the system and having a psychologically safe company. You can do some level of virtue signaling about talking about A players as well. And so I think that my statement earlier is that you have a bunch of people in your company who would be just fine and contribute very, very meaningfully for your company, who are basically have come to some balance agreement with their existence in that company about how hard they want to work to improve things, and have found actually the healthiest balance. These are healthy people. They go out, they leave work, they have fun, they go on vacations, they don't worry about work outside of work. And they're generally just this kind of silent majority of people in the company who are pragmatists and are not going to necessarily try to push the needle. Now, that sounds heretical. Like imagine you're a tech founder and you hear John Cutler say, well, 50% of your people in your company are they've found a balance with your company. They're going to take their money. They're going to take their risk and give you work in exchange. That is so horrifying for some group of people, the idea that of what I'm saying, because they need to believe that, in fact, they've somehow found the top, 1% of anyone in the world, that they've done everything possible to make sure they're going to be a raving success, that everyone would literally cut off their left hand for the company, like anything like that. It's much easier to think that way. And so this causes a fair amount of tension for people overall.
Okay, so you have outlined the problem on why everything is weird. So what do we do about it? Like, isn't this a little bit like, well, like, don't play the lottery, just play it when the numbers are right? Isn't that like a little bit of a similar analogy? Do you know what I mean?
I think there's 2 or 3 lenses which are helpful. One is the individual lens, right? Which is, it starts with self-awareness about yourself and your identity and what you believe and what you're passionate about. And there's a great book called Getting to Yes with Yourself by William Ury. I think it's a great book because it's to negotiate with anything, you need to actually negotiate with yourself. It's a heavy thought if you think about it. And then I think that from a personal perspective, it's like, it's not black or white. We have some marginal control over the decisions we make, where we put ourselves, the environments that we select, the people that we gather around us. And it is a spectrum. It's not, this is why I get so pissed off when people are like, the best companies and the rest. Show me the distribution diagram of that. Show me the distribution of the best and the rest. And it's made even worse when I know people in the companies that they say are the best companies. And these people are like, I've never been in such a dumpster fire than this particular place, right? So the world is not black and white like that, right? Like 2 things can be true. You can be in an environment, and a great example of this is some companies have a couple years, like 3 to 5 years, when everyone will look back on that and say, that was a transformative experience in my life. It was the right place, the right time, the right company. And then the company shifts gears and will meet the needs of other types of people. And that's, if you have the privilege to be able to move between companies, which now in the job market is not a given, you can find the next place. So that's the individual lens, I think, about what's going on. But I think on the company lens, the conclusion I've come to is there's no company lens. There's a great book by Ralph Stacey, who's a complexity theorist, and he talks about strategy and complexity. And he has this thing called the as-if problem, where you view companies as if they were something, as if they were a human, as if they were a garden, as if they are a ecosystem entity. And it's a compelling thing because some models are useful, but all models are wrong. So if you think of a company as a garden, you'll come up with analogies like we need to tend the garden, we need to plant new seeds, we need to do different stuff. Or if you think of a company as a brain, it's a useful model because you think, wow, we have some kind of collective intelligence like the neurons in someone's brain. But he talks about the as-if problem because at a certain point, all a company is the sum of the interactions with the people, not just within the company, but them and their families, them and their communities, them and their professional communities. It's people all the way down. And what you're seeing at the level is like a population level effect of the company. So what I'm saying is basically is that at the end of the day, it's about us, it's about our interactions with other human beings and working to at least make those interactions a more positive experience for ourselves on some level for some period of time. And I think that that's my personal attitude and approach to it. And so I think that, other people, you got to believe what you believe, but that's what I believe at least.
So what are you trying to say in terms of like post-analysis? So, I mean, I agree with you in the assessment that most people are doing the heretic act of not putting the company above their own babies and families and so forth. I would say that's a fair statement. So what do you conclude from this now? So like, what should we do with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that these are some of the things I've been thinking about lately, which is if you're a leader, you can do at least a reasonable job to try to design, I use the word design intentionally there, or foster an environment that has at least a reasonable probability of meeting people's needs, your needs, the company's needs, the customer's needs, the investor's needs. You can do a terrible job and you can do a better job. So that's where the thing is, it's not black and white. So if you're a leader and you say every team is going to do 2-week sprints and is going to work with story points and is going to do X, Y, Z, you're making a bad decision. You're not making a good design decision in most cases. There might be a small number of cases where you're making the right decision. But that's what you can do as a leader to take away from this is that it's not black and white. It's not like everything's lost and that our work is just some bureaucratic prison. And it's also not like our work is some meritocratic hero's journey, rock star, tech bro kind of thing. It's somewhere in the middle, right? So I think that that's the takeaway. for these things, not to get too philosophical, is we can do a better job than worse job to at least try to make decisions that will foster something. And I'll tell you, I've been meeting with a lot of teams recently, and sometimes you just see such amazing, heartwarming situations. You observe, a lot of teams invite me into their team rituals because my product helps them operate more effectively and efficiently and stuff. So they'll invite me to like a meeting or a review or whatever. And sometimes you're at one of these reviews and you're like, this is great. These are a bunch of humans, zero, I don't think politics are inherently bad actually, but it's just like zero pathological behavior in this one meeting. People are being respectful. They're working through ideas. They're making it move forward. And I tell you, when you see those meetings, it brings like joy to my heart, because you see that there are opportunities at some sphere to create conditions where people are having their needs met. Now, as you move up in an organization, the level of pathology increases to the point that those situations become increasingly rare. And the number of situations that lend themselves to that type of behavior become more rare. But as a manager, or maybe as a leader, as a director, or something like that, you do have maybe more power than you think to create boundaries of good things. So I think that's very heartwarming. That gives me a lot of optimism, frankly.
So there's an interesting bit in there that I'm thinking about, as I've also written about it, and I think it is about this magical unicorn of an empowered organization, because that's what this is, in my opinion, right? So why should I, as a commercial leader, in any way care about the well-being of the people that are working for me? That is a legit question, and it is a good question as well. I actually do think that we should address this question because it's not, a company's purpose is not to make the people happy inside of it. It is unfortunately to kind of serve the capitalistic overload that it functions in. So one of the reasons why I really like the job that I have and the work that you and me and all the others are doing together is because I do believe that currently, and not just in this market environment, I mean like in the last 10 to 20 years, whatever, companies who have an empowered structure, and I'm going to get into this, what that means specifically, actually also fare better commercially for a very specific reason. And that is not as dystopian as it sounds. It just means that there is interest in keeping people honestly and thoroughly happy inside of an organization to a very specific, to a good degree, that is not just performative, which is something that has been happening as well, because companies in marketing, they always try to then copy things, they try to copy good shit, right? In the world, and then it's getting worse. But I'm just going to pause here for a second. But would you agree to this particular statement? Because I have some very specific points about this, why I do believe this is true.
Yeah, I think that there is a couple thoughts. First of all, there's this great book, How Big Things Get Done, How Big Things Get Done by Flyberg. And he talks about mega projects. We're talking about nuclear power plants and solar energy fields and shipping facilities and railway projects and things like that. And he mentions a bunch of principles inside that particular book because he has a directory, he works at Oxford, I think, and he has a directory of thousands of mega projects and whether they achieved their budget, whether they happened in the time frame that they happened, etc. What's fascinating about the book is that the exact same principles he mentions for mega projects and the success of mega projects, forget about the word empowered for a second and just say some amount of loose coupling where teams can make decisions locally faster with available information.
Yeah.
Even in these mega projects, each thing he alludes to suggests these principles. So, for example, one of the things is this idea of think slow, act fast, which is before, there is a period of time before you do something where you can think slow when it's cheap to think and then act. But if you think about it as relates to teams, it's one thing, if the leadership team is thinking slow and then just throws a project over for people to just build this, that's not thinking slow, right? That might be good with the acting fast, but it's not very good for the actually thinking through the particular thing. That's one example. The other he gives is modularity. So for example, the reason why solar facilities have a much higher rate of success is that solar is modular. You can build solar facilities in modules. You can create there's less coupling basically to begin with to do it. He also gives the example of the Heathrow Airport, where there was a new terminal at the Heathrow Airport, and it talks about like why that was successful. And he notes that there's always danger in picking and cherry picking. So he backs it with the research he's done across other companies. But again, there was like a level of empowerment. There was this mix of local decision making versus like lightweight global coordination. They broke into particular groups, but then they came back together at different times. So I think that the funny part about it is, as much as we want to, like from a cultural angle and a philosophical angle, we like the idea, we say empowered teams, that's great. When reading that book or thinking about other things, there's just a physics reason why it's more effective in many cases, because decisions happen more quickly, closer to the information that's necessary, and you can think slower, act faster where it matters to be able to do the things. And I'll end with one point is that, in response to when people talk about empowered teams, I have this model called the mandate levels, which is like a series of mandates, ranging from A, which is build exactly this, all the way up to create these long-term business outcomes, which is maybe H. It's maybe 10 levels or 8, I forget. And it is just fascinating because between companies, there can be some kind of cultural differences. Like in some companies, it's like directors are more solution-focused and maybe their bosses are less solution-focused. Or in other companies, teams are just in the build exactly this, while their managers are telling them what to build to do those things. And it becomes very clear when you do workshops with people and activities that when you aren't driving teams to have as high a mandate as possible, it simply creates more opportunities for kind of information loss along the way and lengthens feedback loops. So I think there's just like a core, almost physics related reason to why more independent or autonomous teams are better for many of the problems we have.
So let me try to retell the story a little bit from my angle, because I think I'm going to say the same, and then you can challenge me on it in case you don't agree. But I think, so I've written about this like 3 to 4 years ago in an article that was called Organizational Scaling Principles. And I was talking about this, and I think I lifted this from a book, Team of Teams, from this General Stanley McChrystal, about the military, where he's talking about this. And I'm not sure how close it is to the book, so, it's all a pudding at this point.
Yeah.
I don't remember anymore. But I think he was talking about collective consciousness, which means the shared understanding that we have inside of a company based on the information that we're giving and how we're giving. So, talking openly about, hey, here's how the revenue is doing. These are the problems that we're solving. Here are the things that we believe in. Not only is it important that you have access to these, but there is a pervasive culture of the opposite. So what is the opposite of that? The opposite of that is to be secretive about metrics, because you believe like, oh, you're only operating on a need to know basis,
right,
for security reasons or whatever, because everybody wants to know what your ARR is, including their mothers and grandmothers, or concealing harsh truths in the favor of professionalism. That's another one that I really hate. Or not having cross-functional teams is also, unfortunately, like limiting this kind of information flow. So when you are having a matrix organization where one function sits on one floor and another one sits on another floor, you're breaking the patterns. It doesn't help. It's like you would separate the patients and the doctors from each other.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, let's put all the doctors over there so they can discuss with each other about the patients who are over there, and they can complain a little bit to each other. So that's one thing. The second thing is like the empowerment stuff. So like having autonomy to do decisions as an expert means that you're switching to a culture that is, hey, I ask for feedback versus I ask for permission. So we don't want to have people that ask for permission. I want people to ask for feedback. Does this fit into the bigger picture in what we want to achieve? There's a fundamental difference there. And I think between these two, there's a very interesting thing happening, because I know you're also talking or thinking about this quite a lot. I think while the principle of this is all correct, I would add one more thing to it nowadays, which is the simplicity of this information. So what do we choose to share with the organization and what do we not choose is absolutely critical, because the bandwidth of a person in modern environment to consume anything is extremely limited and overestimated. So you will have people who have been shouted at for 5 hours straight, jumping late into the next call, and then they're expected to retain something about a company strategy that they hear once in 3 months, along with metrics and so forth, right? So like I do think there's a very important point of like focus and simplicity as well that needs to be also captured in there.
It's also I've been thinking a lot about this question, obviously, recently, because when you meet people from different companies, you see different approaches to these particular things. And one thing I can say is that take an air traffic controller. An air traffic controller is filled with many, many instruments and lots of information. However, the information they see is relevant for the job they need to do. It's purpose-built and designed for them to look at a complex situation and surface the things that they need to do to be able to move the situation forward. So what you tend to see in companies, which is funny, is that you have like an operational review meeting. And literally in that meeting, they're talking about some of the big projects they have. They're talking about some of the metrics they're trying to move. They talk about other things. And there's no consistency where it matters. So it's a very ineffective way to coordinate this particular thing. And so what I tend to notice is that people actually have a capacity to handle a lot more information than they normally have in these contexts. But the information as presented to be relevant to the decisions they need to make is not great. And so a very specific example of this would be, in an operational review meeting, you need the people who could potentially answer those questions and have detailed enough information to answer those questions, ready to discuss the things. Also, you don't need to go through everything. You don't need to go through the greens. You just actually need to have an agenda about the ones that are moving into red. You need to have someone spend a little bit of time to provide the context to people. Even a 2-minute silent read while you're there in the meeting to orient people about what they're doing. And so this is the funny thing, there was a recent podcast, I think, with the founder of Shopify, and people were somehow horrified. And he said in the meeting, like, I can scan 150 projects and know where to get involved. And people are like, well, how can you scan 150 projects? How can you do that? And I was thinking about it, and I'm like, 150 is not a big number. It is actually not difficult if you had 35 minutes to become somewhat acclimated to the boundaries of 150 projects, right? And it doesn't happen in one day, but through successive rituals and focusing on the right thing, you can get the right information to be able to do it. So I think that the fascinating part of this is that in many tech companies, the pendulum shifted so far into the high autonomy, low alignment area, just chaos basically. Yeah. And not enough attention was made to what it really requires to create aligned autonomy in that particular situation. And so you had a fair amount of chaos. Now, if you take your average big enterprise, massive enterprise, they have the opposite problem. They have extremely low autonomy because there's so many dependencies that require high alignment. The only way to get anything done will be to have 300 people meet every quarter and try to resolve all their dependencies together. And so there is this, I think that both sides shoot themselves in the foot a little bit, right? Like the way that a lot of chaotic tech companies run, they're missing many, many opportunities for more lightweight alignment that they could have if they were just a little better at designing some of these rituals. And meanwhile, in the big enterprises, they could have opportunities for more autonomy if they work to kind of remove some of these dependencies that exist to allow things to emerge. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy between different types of companies. It's the same coin flipped around for many companies.
So I think there's a lot of good points in there. Let's see whether we can peel the onion, so to speak, a little bit away. Because I think what you're talking about fundamentally is it's not so much about what I can retain in my job. It's more about what I can retain that is also relevant to my job. I would go as far and say that we do not spend as companies enough time to think about what we should share with someone. And I'm not talking about withholding information. I'm not talking about this. But you know how it is, right? You have someone around, you have a shitty advisor like you or me that's coming around and they do something, you know what's happening. Everything that they do is going to go on a Notion page, which is going to vanish somewhere in a document collection that nobody's looking at. Maybe an AI is just like occasionally scraping over it, but that's about it. It's funny to me if you think about it in this way, because let's say you're learning a new language. And let's say I do not speak English and you are teaching it to me. This is exactly what's happening. Of course, the CEO knows what the ARR is, the MRR, and the AOV, and the GMV, and the CAC, and whatever, like all these metrics. Of course. You know why? Not because he's the CEO or she is the CEO, because they use it on an almost daily basis where it makes sense.
Yeah.
So when you do share these metrics, and I think you should, by the way, when you're sharing these metrics inside of the company, the PMs and the designers or whoever is going to work with them, they also need to use them in some way. So whether that is in the planning, so like they need to tie it back to the revenue and so forth, because otherwise what you are creating is a nice sign full of vocabulary that nobody is ever speaking. And
Right.
if you're not speaking things, I remember this also from when I learned Spanish. In average, you need to hear a word, I think, or like you need to repeat it about 7 times in different, also interleaving, what's called intervals, right? Like before you can even recall something important. If that is true for simple things like individual words, then it is also true for information that is inside of a company.
Right. Well, you need to pick the right. I mean, part of the trick is this global interface problem, right? Which is you can't have so many things that are global without basically people are going to just work around those things on a local level, and I joke sometimes, companies are saying, well, we need an initiative roadmap. So what's an initiative? What's an initiative? Okay, is this project that's going to take 3 quarters that literally will only be done at the end if 15 different teams do what they need to do? Can you legitimately view that or talk about it in the same meeting as that team that's moving a metric for the last 3 quarters? No, you can't. In fact, one person's initiative is they don't even need to put them in the system. They just need to tell everyone in the company when something will be released and what you need to know about it. And they only need to tell you 5 days before they do it if it's important. The other team, it's like landing an aircraft carrier on an aircraft carrier. It's really, really hard, right, to do that. You're landing a huge Titanic, hopefully not into an iceberg. And so one of the things that happens in companies, and the simplicity thing is the most interesting part. And I had this thought the other day. And so imagine, I don't know if you've been to a country that has like a canal system or a lock system. You see these parts where they let in the water and then they move the boat down and then they do it. And then also consider what like a real river looks like. A real river is turbulent. There's so many different currents. There's so many things happening. There's the side current. There's the central current. There's swirls. There's things. What I found kind of funny is when people talk about waterfall, the waterfall is the canal system. The boat only goes down when we do these things. But in fact, water is beautiful. In a stream, water is beautiful. That like flow is a thing, right? Like work is moving, things are happening or doing whatever. So I just kind of found it fascinating that like a lot of the things, like if you work in a company that does these big heavy duty waterfall projects, it feels complex. It hurts your head, like all the coordination, all the movement, all the things feels like you're in a very tense situation. If you work in a company that's more sort of flowing like water, there's local context, there's global context, there's things moving, it's still complex. Like product work and social product work is always going to be complex. But the latter, the flowing of a river or whatever, feels simple. And so one thing that executives kind of get mixed up is that if you show them reality, they'll say that's too complex. And you'll say, no, this is just reality. Literally, 175 people were involved and touched this work. They don't want to believe that. They can't believe that. If anyone says that, it's like, well, this is impossible. We have so much bureaucracy in our company. I can't believe that would happen. But if you show them a simple red, amber, green view in a spreadsheet and say green, it's like, okay, this is nice. They'd be able to do it. So my point, though, is that part of all this is it's about how to synthesize information at the right level for the right people without taking away the essence of the thing, without making the simplification something that means less good decisions happen, but allowing people to make the decisions that they need to make. Like the aircraft controller example is it's designed for them to make the decisions they need to make right now. And so I leave that with thoughts for people, which is basically product work is complex and it's a beautiful thing. It's like recording records. It's a creative thing. However, the boundaries around that complexity and the interfaces you have and how people make decisions is what gives you the feeling that the way you work is simple and is easy to put in your head and to do it. So it's interesting.
I disagree on one little thing. I'm not disagreeing on the whole point. Like, you and me, we are very much aligned, but I don't think the word simple is actually correct here. But let me use a metaphor of a very fringe interest that I have on the side. Do you know what is the number one hallmark of a good restaurant?
Good food?
A simple menu. It is very commonly the case that if you have, and let's just say, Michelin restaurants, or higher fine dining and so forth, what they commonly have is, first of all, they hide the prices. Please don't do that. That's not what I'm trying to say, right? Like, don't hide your pricing pages. But they usually have relatively simple menus in the amount of selection that they have.
Right.
Why? Because what they want to execute is executed at the highest standards and so forth, right? So having said that, and I do think that this is actually correct, running a restaurant is not a simple thing. That's not what I'm trying to say. So what I'm trying to say is that the crafted output that goes out to the customers and so forth has the utmost level of, quality that is whatever that means, right? But the complexity of the business is resting with the managers and not with the individual cooks per se. Yes, it is hard to create a piece of meat to a very specific standard when customers have specific wishes and so forth, but you are still assigned to a very specific station. At the same time, in the morning, if you've ever seen like how a restaurant is being run, they get together and discuss the menu every day. Everybody knows exactly what their piece that needs to be of the highest quality is contributing to the overall story. So what can happen as well is that one person was falling sick or, something unplanned is happening. Some of the ingredients went bad or whatever. Like you have to improvise. And that is only possible to improvise if you know the system good enough to cover for others as well. So I have some metrics as well in my head that I'm using for this. So I want to get very, very specific on this. I don't know a good, like any company that I have been with where I would say like, this is a good, well-oiled machinery in relativity, right? So like, they have good data and so forth, they're running well. None of them have more than 3 ICPs, for instance, per 150 people. I don't know a single company that is running well that has like 15 ICPs and then one person kind of needs to work with them. It just doesn't work this way. Why? Because despite your efforts that you think, you cannot cram more into a person's head than like 3 different concepts of targets that you should develop for.
Right.
And I think this is where this is. So this is why I like the metaphor so much of like simplified. So how do you get to a simple menu if you have a crowded menu? Well, you need to cut. You need to think about what are we not cooking today? And I know you also have some thoughts on this. So like, what is the art of not doing something is right now when we're shipping so much and we have so much capabilities of doing things, maybe becoming more important than the planning of what we do.
Well, the way that I would address that, and this is why I respond a little negatively when people talk about just simplify, because I think there's a couple things going on there. What I like about what you mentioned is that as a company scales, you get a nonlinear increase in complexity based on the number of markets you're trying to be, the motions you're trying to do, the products you're trying to make, or whatever. So it's not linear. And it's not sublinear. It doesn't like even, the dream of SaaS was that it was actually sublinear. That if you imagine on the x-axis, the scale of the company and maybe the revenue, and if you think on the y-axis is the cost of accumulated complexity, the dream of SaaS was that actually this line becomes flatter.
Yeah.
Because you're doing, now, that is at odds with what we generally know about companies. That in fact, as you build more motions and as you do more things, the cost actually increases superlinearly and it starts to go up. And you start to get this S curve to go up and do these things. So I think what's fascinating about that is that what tends to happen in companies is that when a lot of leaders talk about, well, we just need to simplify, they want to simplify, but without having to make any hard decisions.
Yeah, exactly.
They just want it to seem simpler. They just want to look at something that makes it feel simpler. They just want the feeling that it's easier to get things done, or the feeling that it's doing these things without having to make any hard decisions about like, we're not going into that business or we're not going to be able to do these particular things. Now, I think the interesting part about that is there is some room also around to be just operationally efficient or capitally efficient. So although, the leader is saying, we're going to not go into that market, probably has the biggest impact on that curve of increasing complexity and the cost of said complexity, right? But there's also some ways, for example, the org design that you have, where a lot of SaaS companies went wrong is that they insisted on going multi-product, but they didn't do it in a smart way. And so, for example, I worked at a company here in Santa Barbara. The company's called Appfolio. And one of their innovations, I think, was that they were able to add quote unquote additional products, but they added them under the idea of, they called them value-added services. And at least while I was there, they never landed with the value-added services. In fact, they called them value-added services, right? Mm-hmm. And for the most part, the pricing models for those services fit into the existing pricing model and the existing packaging of the company. So this is a fascinating thing to me, right? Where people say, we're going multi-product. I've been at companies that went multi-product in a huge way. You know what? And then 3 years later, they rolled back to blank one. They had 15 products on a landing page, and then eventually they came all the way back to having just one package for the whole thing. And so that's why I think that there's something to be said also in this equation for design decisions in how you package and price, and design decisions in terms of how you go to market with things aren't created equal. And so that's where strategy comes into play. Like, strategy is to look at a market and say, you know what? If we package and price our product the right way, we should be able to access that extra TAM without the cost of that TAM being so high that it doesn't make sense for us to be able to go into that business. And so that's where strategy comes in place. So I agree with what you're saying. I just think that it's two sides of the same coin, in a sense, where there are many like big decisions you can make to reduce this sort of increase of complexity, but there's also many small decisions you can make to bend that curve.
I just think that it is so much harder right now to really make a good strategy. It's like, if you do believe in this approach, so let's just say you agree with everything that we've been saying, right? So like basically what you're saying is that, hey, like as a leader, you become more of a gardener rather than like a dictator that is telling others what to do and so forth. But in any case, someone still needs to kind of define the boundaries of the garden, like, so how far does the garden reach? And like, what do we do with that garden? So all of this is kind of fair game. So what I'm thinking about here is that this is not so much about simplicity, as you said already, absolutely correct. This is more about simple specificity. And I think it always comes a little bit full circle sometimes. I don't know whether you remember this. I think we talked about this at some point, but I think the book is called 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Berkman, where they talk, or like where he talks about how should you set the priorities in your life, whatever that means, without optimizing your efficiency all the time. And one of the simple concepts in this is that if you list out all the priorities of what is important to you, and you can do this also for a company, you get easily a list of 20, 30, 40 things. The dangerous things are not the ones all the way down to the list. The dangerous things are the ones that are close to the top but not at the top. So let's say you want to create your menu of 3 items. Priority number 4 is the most dangerous thing, not the thing on 20, right? That's what you need to talk about. That's when you say, like, here's our roadmap, here's what we're doing this year, and we actively avoid this thing over here that sounds good, tastes good, looks good, but it's probably not worth it. That is how you achieve the specificity, by kind of, saying like, hey, this is super attractive, but we're not dating it for this particular year.
Yeah.
That's how I'm thinking about it, like from a leader's perspective.
I have a fascination with the problem you just mentioned as well, which is at a certain point, I'll talk to leaders and say, look, I have designed the organization to be able to do more than 2 things at once. So I've had leaders say, I will not create a forced ranked list. I need a committed list. I need you to tell me, are you going to get to the 7th thing or not? And what's fascinating about that is if you think about the psychology. Now, to put myself in their shoes, imagine if it's a 15-year-old company, 10, 15-year-old company. You've hired VPs, you're spending tons of money on salary, you're doing all these things. All the VPD comes to you and says, you need to force rank priorities. You need to focus. You need to do it. And you're the leader of this company and you're like, have I spent all this money on salaries and architecture and these things for you to tell me you can't walk and chew gum at the same time? Is that what you're telling me? Because I want you to tell me. I want you to tell me these are my priorities. I want you to say, I can get you that, but not this. Like I'm not going to give you the forced rank list of priorities. You have to do it. And you know what? It's actually a feasible argument from the leader. If you put yourself in your shoes of the person, or any time that I've done that and been in that position, it's an interesting thing. Now, I think what's missing in most of those environments is as follows. The leader saying that does not, and it could also be because of the VPs that report to them or whatever, they do not appreciate the number of invisible dependencies and this kind of like less tangible increase in nonlinear complexity that exists. And so what they're basically saying is, I thought we designed this place to be able to do independent things at once. And I thought, whenever we've had problems, I always think it's a management problem. So I try to hire new managers to fix it and they don't do a good job. So maybe it's their problem. So it's a fascinating thing that so if I work at a startup, what do we have? We have a forced rank list. We trust everyone. We tell them at the top, we say, if, do the thing at the top or get out of the way of the thing at the top. And if you can move down the stack, if you can't work on the thing at the top, move down the stack and move down the stack because we appreciate the complexity of what exists at the moment. But it is kind of amazing that one of the big problems is realistically at any company of any size, you've designed the company to do more than one thing at once. And how to have the dialogue around that and to face the reality when things start to crack is the big problem, in my experience.
I am still, so I don't have a ton of experience with bigger companies. I think the biggest that I have worked with is like 250 to 300 people, like effectively. So, but I always return to Dunbar's number.
Yeah.
I think it is incredibly hard to share the same kind of knowledge base to people above 150. So I think it was Johnson & Johnson. I don't remember from which books that I've read that one as well. But like, so the principle is always that, after 150, you start to separate your organization. Not the products necessarily, but you start to kind of look, back in the days when people worked in the same building. Remember those? You start to kind of separate people because after 150 people, you don't know anymore, like physically, like what is their name, right? So like that kind of thing. And I think this comes down a lot to what you just said, in the sense of we have some sort of weird expectation that we can outsource this need of simplicity to our middle managers or to these managers in some kind of way, and then they're not capable of doing it. However, I do think, so I'm still not sure whether you're advising for the stack ranking or not, like forced ranking, right? So but I actually do, because if you assume that a company is limited in the same way that your time during a day is limited, if you do not focus on something, then you will never master anything.
Yep.
Even if everything is correct that you're doing.
Yeah, what I recommend is I do believe in force ranking. Yeah. My point, though, is that the force ranking itself is a hypothesis. So in my prioritization workshop, for example, I say you should prioritize even at the highest level to be able to do it. What you're typically prioritizing is at that point, everything is valuable. Actually, the main problem is whether it's urgent or not. So at a certain point of prioritization, you get to just the valuable things. So the debate is about the urgency of those things. It's not about the value of those things. And it's also about the leverage based on how much investment you think it's going to take. That's where the argument happens to do it. And so when it comes to that, you should have a forced rank list of those things. However, what I try to tell people is that the ranking is a hypothesis of how the org chart will manifest across those priorities in terms of an investment mix. And so I'll give you a very clear example. Let's say a company has 5 things on a force ranked list. The first one is basically high urgency items that are blocking. They're not the most valuable things, but they're so urgent that if you don't stop the production issue, everything will go down the tubes, right? In that case, you should put out the production issue. Now, let's say at the moment that company, they set their priorities and they go for the next 6 months, and it turns out that literally 80% of their time is spent in that first bucket, putting out the fires and doing that stuff. Well, they had a hypothesis, and those innovation efforts that they thought they would get to, which are the 5th on the list, which are actually very high value but lower urgency, they didn't get to it. Well, that's a clue for you that either there's just simply too much of the first category of stuff, or there are perhaps some operational efficiencies that would have helped you get down further in that, maybe. But to our point before, that's a secondary problem, secondary hypothesis, right? The primary hypothesis is there was just too much of that first category of work. So the way that I tend to think about force ranking prioritization is it's much more about the dialogue about how efforts cascade down that stack, depending on this. At a company of maybe over 150 or 300 or whatever size place, you've designed the org to potentially get to the 5th one on the list and do them. You might not get there. And therefore, that's a good clue for you that you need to do something. You need to focus the business. You need to be more operationally efficient. Something is getting you down. What tends to happen, though, unfortunately, is that all the VPs get together, they horse trade their thing. The one who's on the 5th on the list says, I'm still going to get my bonus if I do this, right? Okay, we're going to do that. And so instead of dealing through that whole list as a team, you're just basically having everyone fight for their place on the list.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. There's also another thing. I think you said this with a little bit of different words, which is if you have too much depth in the organization, not talking about just tech depth, but any depth, where you're just you're just busy dealing with support tickets and some other shit and counting the points rather than getting rid of the points of the backlog and so forth, then you can also end up in a situation like this. So, John, this was a fantastic conversation. I know you have to go, and I appreciate your time quite a lot. And I just wanted to ask one more thing, because I was asked this also in my community. If we're taking all of this now together, and we're thinking about this as leaders or as product managers and so forth, what do you think are the best skills to have to go forward into the future for this? And so is there something that we can work on specifically? I know that's a very specific question.
I would break this down into sort of leaders, managers, or whatever to these things. I think that most people would benefit from studying a little bit about sociology and how groups of people are actually existing in these environments. Because I think I'll end on a funny story. There is a team in Northern Europe. And from what I understand from the person I chatted with, the leadership team just decided to take a course at the local college for sociology, a graduate course. And all the leaders did it. They finished that thing and they immediately came back to work and they got rid of like 70%, 75% of all the process they had. And he's like, we don't actually need OKRs. We don't need these things. Like, we need to show up as humans, accepting our kind of fragility in these human systems that we're at, but also leaning into what we can contribute to being a better environment. So that's what I'd lead to anyone, which is not to harp on the quote unquote soft skills, but there's elements of this that we all can be sort of better educated and better aware of how these type of messy human systems exist. And so that's what I would leave people to think about.
Do you have a book that you prefer that you think is really good in this regard by any chance?
Well, I think that one book that changed how I see all of this is a book called Images of Organization. And the author walks you through 8, I think, different lenses to view organizations, from brains to machines to learning systems to political systems to psychic prisons, which I think is crazy, to instruments of domination, to environments of flux and transformation. So it basically goes through all the different like mental models we have of organizations. What's fascinating about the book is that the conclusion is basically you cannot adopt just one lens. So if all you have is the I believe in the meritocracy sports team lens, you're going to almost by definition you'll just be only taking one lens. Now, there's some value to that lens, but it's one of like 6 potentially helpful lenses to think about an organization. And so that's what anyone can do, right? Is to jump out of their favorite lens, whether that's the performance lens. This is the problem with some of the people in the agile community, right? They're so into what they're doing, but they are also obsessed with one of the lenses that kind of lends itself. They actually say that they don't believe in Taylorism, but they actually are viewing the organization as a machine. It's just a different kind of machine. You see this a lot too. I fall into this trap of, you draw a bunch of arrows with lines between them and you think, aha, I see the reality of the company. You don't see the reality. You're taking one lens of a reality to do that. And so I would suggest that is a great book.
Images of Organization by Gareth Morgan. I just looked it up. It will be in the show notes.
And I think it's an old book, so you might even be able to find a PDF if you look hard enough to do it.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, John. This is it. That's the end of this episode, and I see you soon again in 5 months.
In 5 months. 5 months and 5 days and 5 hours. Okay.
That's exactly what it's going to be. Thank you, ciao.
All right, bye. See you.
Thank you so much for listening to The Product Tea with Leah. If you don't have enough yet, you can subscribe to my podcast right now on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or you can head to my website, leahtarin.com, which is leahtarin.com, where you can find much more of my material or just want to work with me.